I would like to thank the organizers, Fertility Europe and ESHRE, for inviting me here. My name is Maciej Smiechowski, and I will talk today about gamete donation and family building. I am a non-genetic father or social father of twins born from IVF with donor sperm. This I am required to show, I was told. So I decided to split today's presentation into 3 parts to put it more in historical context. So let's start with part 1. It disappeared. Hello. Excuse me, guys. Hello. Technical support, please. Sorry for that. So let's start with part 1 of my story, which is simply the story. Or more specifically, the history of a shady business that was born from lies and deception. So let us begin with the first modern account of artificial insemination by donor, AID, that found its way to the annals of medicine. The now oddly sounding paper Artificial Impregnation from 1909 by Addison David Hart, once a student of William Pancoast, who himself witnessed this procedure in 1884 in Jefferson Medical College, Philadelphia. As Gregor and Mayer write in The Impregnators, quote, "Whether Pancoast acted as a scientist or submitted to pressure from his students will never be known. At any rate, semen was collected from the best-looking member of the class, and while the woman was anesthetized with chloroform, the semen was inserted into the uterus with a hard rubber syringe and the cervix plugged with gauze. Neither the husband nor the wife was told of the procedure," end quote. Let that sink in. The first ever reported AID procedure was a non-consensual procedure, or there was only one person who expressed consent, Pancoast himself. We learn eventually that the husband was told, and then the son resembled him, cementing the illusion. Fast forward 30 years from Hart's account, Mary Barton opens her fertility clinic in London, one of the first ever, from the outset offering AID procedures to desperate patients. Her groundbreaking work, Artificial Insemination, appeared in British Medical Journal in 1945. Let's remember the name Wiesner. It will be very important soon. The paper is very technical, duly reporting all small details of procedures, but one thing is particularly interesting. Barton's unwavering conviction that the mutual anonymity must be maintained first and foremost. Quote, "Now we carry anonymity to the point where the donor is never described to the patient, save in most general terms," end quote. Her work was promptly condemned by the medical community of the time, but the seeds were sown, and the AID business would soon enter its heyday. So Barton openly admitted what we see here. A very small panel of donors has been established so far. But her expectations from a donor were truly ground. We are not talking rookie numbers here. Quote, "It follows that a fecund donor submitting 2 specimens weekly could, with ideal conditions, produce 400 children weekly. That is about 20,000 annually," end quote. Much later, it was found that the panel of donors was indeed limited, with Barton's husband playing a major role. Barry Stevens, a Canadian filmmaker, was instrumental in documenting the extent of patient mishandling in Barton's clinic. In his 2 documents, Offspring and Biodeath, he speculated that Wiesner can have hundreds of children, including him, possibly 600. It was found that Wiesner's close friend, Derek Richter, could father further 100 kids. I wonder whether Wiesner asked himself the question, what would it be like to father 600 children? And now, this is a story that takes a special place in my heart. The book, All the Children of Louis, written by a young Polish reporter, Kamil Bałuk, was my entry into the world of shady donor conception practices and prompted me to rethink my role as a father who has no genetic connection to own kids. We are in the Netherlands, and that was the scandal that shook the Netherlands. And it was revolving around the practice of a single doctor, Jan Karbat from Barendrecht. He was famed for miraculous results in inseminations. He too maintained strict anonymity of donors, for a good reason. He was later confirmed as the father of at least 49 children. This anonymity came with a price. Emotionally detached fathers that were told never to reveal anyone what has happened, with a deeply disturbed self-esteem. And what about Louis? He was the most prolific of the Karbat's donors. It turned out that his motivation was deeply disturbed. He said he felt as a pharaoh building his pyramid. Almost 100 children are confirmed to be conceived by him, and the number may well reach over 200. His half-siblings now maintain close ties, just like in Timo's case. So in part 2, things get personal. This is the experience, or when the story becomes my story. So we started our infertility journey in 2009, when I first learned about my oligozoospermia. We have a long story to tell, so I will fast forward to the moment that we are told to think about IVF. So karyotyping was performed first as one of the initial tests, and I learned that I'm a carrier of balanced chromosomal translocation. I remember reading this cryptic cipher and wondering, what does this even mean? So we consulted our fertility doctor about the options, and we were offered two choices: the slow lane of carefully selecting embryos, performing PGD, and hoping for the best, or the fast lane, to use donor sperm and thus bypass my genetic makeup. We opted for the fast lane, thus inviting a third party to our family plans. So after the first stimulation and egg fertilization, we had just 2 viable embryos. We already knew the advantage of single embryo transfer. But when posed with the question from a doctor, is it worth to freeze one embryo, we thought, let's trust them. Maybe it is not. So we had a confirmed singleton pregnancy at first. But at some later screening, maybe at 8 weeks gestation, my wife heard, but wait, there is a second one. This shocked us, but then we had to move on anyway. I was watching my wife being pregnant, going to appointments with her and dreaming it's just like being a real father. And soon enough, our children arrived here, safe and sound. And I was there when they were born, and I realized this one overwhelming thing. They are mine. It's always a lot to do with twins in their infancy. We had no time to think about the deeper consequences of our actions. But from the start, we had this conviction that we should at some point tell. The question is who and when. Should the grandparents come first? They knew since the kids were like 2 years old. Close friends? Or first, our relatives. We trusted our siblings enough only to tell them all the details. Close friends? We confided only to most trustworthy ones, and in some cases it wasn't even before the grandparents knew. Doctors, therapists, is it always necessary? When your child catches a bronchitis, it does not necessarily warrant informing the entire medical staff about their genetic provenance. Finally, there was someone who we were most afraid to tell, our kids. We waited perhaps a bit too long, but when we were ready, we knew it. We just waited for the opportunity. When we were talking to my daughter, she held me tight all the time, had tears in her eyes, but she said one important thing. This changes nothing. Our son didn't want to talk at first, but when we finally made him, he heard our story and said, well, that's okay. Is there anything else? We encountered many obstacles on the way that made our situation more difficult. We had this illusion of choice. I remember the doctor matching my eye color and height to the database, producing a short list from which we picked a number that I sadly don't even remember anymore. We never received any psychological support specifically about gamete donation and non-genetic parenthood. My wife was offered one session with therapist, which she later recounted as hardly beneficial. Hopefully the situation in Poland got much better in this respect now. We had a feeling of general lack of guidance and support, of being lost at which way to go, which path to follow. I think that joining Nasz Bocian was a turning point for us. We were also using MAR in a total legal void. Believe it or not, but the first infertility law was introduced in Poland only in 2015. Until then, ART centers acted based on general medical law. Nothing technically prevented them from allowing, for example, double-track donation, but this never happened. All Polish ART centers provided only material from anonymous donors. And this law that I've just talked about made things even worse. It imposes full anonymity. I will tell about this later in more detail. So part 3, the shortest one, is about what can and cannot be done legally to protect the rights of donor-conceived children, like my children or Timo. So international conventions come in handy for shaping local legislation to conform to current expectations of donor-conceived children and their parents. In the European Convention on Human Rights, we find Article 8. Everyone has the right to respect for his private or family life, his home and his correspondence. There shall be no interference by public authority with the exercise of this right. This article was pivotal to the court case brought in 2002 by Joanna Rose and EM, an anonymous child represented by parents, who claimed that their human rights were being breached by being denied access to information about their donor. The case resulted in the UK being one of the first countries allowing only open donation. But sadly, Joanna did not benefit from it herself, as it did not act retrospectively. Convention on the Rights of the Child reads, also in Article 8, states parties undertake to respect the right of the child to preserve his or her identity, including nationality, name, and family relations. And where a child is illegally deprived of some or all of the elements of his or her identity, state parties shall provide appropriate assistance and protection. This document served as a basis for donation regulation in several countries towards more open practices. It was actively quoted by Austria, Switzerland, Western Australia, and Southern Australia when changing their law. Now comes the local Polish specifics that I prefer to call the atrocities of Act on Infertility Treatment. It has many more deficiencies, too many to summarize quickly, so I focus only on those specifically involving donation. There is imposed a complete anonymity of heterologous gamete and embryo donation. The identity of donors will never be disclosed. Donors are also not provided any information about the results of MAR using their gametes or embryos. The necessity of MAR with a heterologous donation is always and exclusively determined by a doctor. The obligation to establish phenotypic compatibility between recipients and donors also lies only in the hands of a doctor. And there is no obligation to provide psychological counseling to donors and recipients, so no regulations have been introduced in this regard. Nowadays, this was changed, and now the parents that are non-genetic are required to have a psychological consultation, but this is still not in the law, but in the Ministry of Health regulations, so one step lower. And I'm always wondering what will the future bring to our family and to donor-conceived persons in general. The direction these days seems to be towards more and more open donation procedures, which I find beneficial for everyone involved. I would like to campaign for making the donation law in Poland more humane and in accordance with the findings of developmental psychology experts. Sadly, even though the legislation may be eventually changed, this won't affect the situation of my children, since the change will for sure be non-retroactive. But there is yet another way of tracing one's roots, which relates to Timo as well. which increasing potential I was really not aware of. But I participated in an ESHRE webinar last year with a fascinating talk given by Jackson Kirkman Brown, and it came as a shock to me that so many people are already registered in public genetic matching databases. With the increasing popularity of such services, any legislation that provides anonymous donation may soon become simply obsolete. I'm looking forward to this moment. And I'm almost out of time, so I will leave you with the acknowledgement screen, and I thank you for your attention.